But let's turn to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 18. Well, we come tonight for the third time to this great chapter as we've worked our way chapter by chapter through the book of Proverbs and seen that in each chapter there is an actual arrangement of Proverbs, like Solomon said he did in Ecclesiastes. And we come to for the third time to this chapter that identifies and examines, at least in good part what it does, is identifies and examines two personality types, the introvert and the extrovert, the socialite and the solitaire. Really, we've been focusing on two perilous personality poles that each of these can go to that are unhealthy in their extremes of these types that we can swing to when our weaknesses run unchecked, which happens to all of us. On one hand, we have verse 24, that Proverbs 18:24, that says, "A man of too many friends comes to ruin." And there's a friend that sticks closer than a brother. That's the golden mean between the two extremes. But on one extreme is the man of many friends. And in the extreme of that personality type, he can easily come to ruin. On the other hand, there's a man with two friends, which is back in verse 1. This chapter is bookended by these two types. Proverbs 28:1, which we've been focusing on for 2 weeks now, the one who separates himself. He who separates himself, as opposed to the man of many friends, seeks his own desire and quarrels against all sound wisdom. So we've been starting with this person at the heart of the hermit when things get out of control in his or her life, the fleshly side of this type. And we've been looking at the selfishness of it all. We've seen that the cause is often betrayal, a brother offended, which we've looked at in this chapter, a real or imagined betrayal where you're a hermit because you've been hurt. For me, it started when my father died when I was 6, and that intensified my natural tendency to be a more private type of person. We've seen that the cause is often what's perceived anyway as a betrayal, which is the way I perceived it. The consequences of betrayal is often withdrawal, where you separate yourself and seek your own desire. We've seen that such withdrawal, understandable though it may be, is ultimately inexcusable if it goes too long, because it can be so selfish. Like my friend told me in seminaries 40-some years ago, or 30-some years ago, "Brian, you're just being selfish. I know your dad died, I know all that, and I understand it, but you're kind of dwelling on it, and God's giving you a call. You need to get over it and get on with it." And that's a word I needed to hear at the time. And so there is a selfishness there. But we're moving now, though, from the heart of the hermit to what's going on in his head. He who separates himself seeks his own desire. And what is the strategy here on the inside? We withdraw, we saw last time, for security. You might call that early retirement. And for spite, which is easy revenge, passive-aggressive behavior. The coward's comeuppance. We looked at various verses that relate to this, the security that drives the separation. And we saw in many ways it's fleshed out in verse 19. He who separates himself, a brother offended, is harder to be won than a strong city. He withdraws into his city. So what's wrong with that? Well, early retirement, we saw buried talents, spurned opportunities that come because we withdraw. So many things happen when we get into ourselves too much. And we lose God's plan and God's purposes for our life. So the strategy behind separating is first and foremost self-protection at all costs in the strong walls of our cities, where we put up our walls. It's early retirement from his service for the sake of security, where we end up ultimately, if you're anything like me, more and more insecure and insulated and wasted. This can really get out of hand in people's lives. In fact, C.S. Lewis said, to love at all is to be vulnerable. So you've been hurt, If you're going to love again, you're going to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, that is, if you want to be totally secure, you must give your heart to no one behind the strong walls of your city. Not even an animal, because animals die. Wrap it carefully round with little hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock up your heart safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. That's security, all right. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, your heart will change. This is what happened to me in a serious way back when I graduated from high school. It will not be broken. It will become impenetrable, unbreakable, and even irredeemable. To love, you must be vulnerable. So, early retirement, for the sake of security, is not a good option. It's often a strategy of, it's often a strategy, though, as we move on tonight, of easy revenge, which is the second part of this, security and easy revenge. It's not just for security, it's often for spite. And it can really affect our relationships as we move now from early retirement to easy revenge. Paradoxically, you withdraw sometimes because you want to retaliate. He who separates himself seeks his own desire, where having been hurt, you return the favor in your own way by separating yourself in its passive-aggressive retaliation against someone. You try to hurt them by withdrawing from them, which can be a very dangerous thing. Security at all costs, and I had to learn this lesson, is not as childlike and blameless as it might seem. We're not just innocents in a cold world when we've been abandoned by parents or whatever. More often than not, we private types can become like militants in a cold war. At least sometimes. I think verse 19 intimates this. The walls of a city and the bars of a castle that Solomon talks about are military metaphors that he's using here. A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. The image here is of a friend trying to reconcile you, trying to win you back, or maybe a spouse trying to win you back. You've been offended, but you've locked your gates. You treat him like an enemy, maybe even lobbing rocks and arrows and scalding water over the walls. Or at the very least, you refuse to grant them entrance when they may need you desperately and when you need them desperately. This happens when people leave the church. I'm out of here. I've been offended. They need us desperately, and vice versa. That's what's so hard about it. When you separate yourself, your silence can be deadly. It'll give the devil an opportunity unless you choose to speak up rather than clam up. And the rest of the Scripture kind of fleshes this out for us. It's clearly taught. The images of easy revenge behind silent walls that come up in the rest of Scripture. Ephesians 4, for instance, if you'll turn there, Ephesians 4:26. Be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger at all costs. Famous verse, but one that we don't often put into the context. We sense the contrast in this passage is between silence and speaking. Look at the verse that comes just before, Ephesians 4:25. Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. We're to be truthful with each other, with our feelings, with our thoughts, with our insights. And the next word, be angry, but do not sin. Yes, you don't hurt people because you're mad, and some people need to work on their words in this respect and say a whole lot less when they get angry. That's the verse 25 portion of chapter 18. But on the other hand, don't let the sun go down on your anger by not talking about it at all. Forgiveness is so hard because so often we've been so silent for so long, which then allows the anger to go so deep. So as soon as possible, make sure you speak the truth about what's going on inside you in the right way, rather than letting it bottle up in you one night after another. Be truthful. Be upfront about things, especially when it comes to your anger. Dialogue about it. Go back and forth. Work it through. Get it behind you with dispatch before it goes down to fester into a root of bitterness. And forgiveness then becomes a formidable task. It seems that to let the sun go down on your anger means one of two things, which really are the two sides of the same coin. On the literal level, it means we're to talk about it before too many days go by, too many sunsets. And figuratively, we're to talk about it while it is still day. As Christ would say, while you see it for what it is, in the light of a more pure heart, and so you can do something about it, while that anger is still uncomfortable in you, while maybe it still pricks your conscience, because before too long, sooner than you might think, you'll just put it off, and the light will kind of go out. And it'll descend into the darkness of your heart, and before you know it, you won't even be aware of it, that it's there, but you're kind of poisoned. And maybe you'll never go back to church again. Or divorce or whatever. Even though this kind of animal is buried alive and not dead. Reminds me of what I was reading in a book called Caring Enough to Confront by David Augsburger. He's talking about speaking the truth, talking and not just burying. He talks about a woman with her husband. She says, the husband mutters over dinner, "That was a tasteless thing to do. It was just like your mother." Whoa. Not a wise husband. What do you do as a wife? You swallow twice at food that suddenly went flat. Freeze into angry silence, get up from the table. Familiar routine. He cuts, you retreat to lick the wound. You see in his eyes that he knows your next move. Retreat to the bedroom, an evening and night of cold, withdrawn anger. When you feel rejected, you reject. So he cut you off. You go off to sulk. What's the point of running, you ask yourself? The longer I brood, the more I hurt, and yet it's so hard for me to go and talk. That's where the rubber meets the road on this kind of thing. And it can be hard for all of us. So the overall contrast in Ephesians 4 is between speaking on one hand, verse 25, and silence in verse 26. And the overall point is don't give them the silent treatment when you get angry. Sometimes you need to withdraw till tempers go down, right? You count to 10, that kind of thing, before you get in a black hole argument with your spouse and there's no getting out of it. There's something to be said for that. But don't separate yourself for too long. Don't withdraw behind your iron bars, your steely silence, because if you do, and this is the next verse in Ephesians 4, verse 27, the devil could soon take over. You give him what Paul calls an opportunity. Don't give the devil an opportunity. How so? Well, I've seen it in my own life. Maybe you have too. It's where Satan can't possess a Christian, but he can take, if we give him a chance, if we indulge in one sin or another, we give him a place, a foothold, where he can kind of intensify it more than it would be in the flesh. And then it's really hard to work it through. It takes longer. It will happen, but it's much harder. How does that work out? You see it all through Scripture. Let's turn to 2 Samuel for a concrete example of this, of withdrawing for the sake of revenge. There's a verse in Proverbs that said, "The righteous learn by watching ruin overtake the wicked." So this is a wicked example by which we can learn. It's the best biblical illustration I know of it, of Proverbs 18:1. It's the story of Absalom's revenge on his half-sister, his half-brother Amnon, for sleeping with his sister Tamar. And it happened in good part because... 2 Samuel 13, sorry. And it all happened in good part because Absalom separated himself in silence. 2 Samuel 13, starting in verse 19. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long-sleeved garment, which was on her, and she put her hand on her head and went away, crying as she went. Verse 20. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, Has Amnon your brother been with you? But now keep silent, my sister. What a counselor he was. Here she was grieving. She was grieving in a totally understandable and healthy way. And he was as much as saying, stuff it. He had an agenda. He didn't really care about her. He was a wicked man. He told her to do the same thing that he ended up doing. It seems we'll probably not take people much further than we've already gone ourselves. But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart. Do not take it to heart. Talk about shutting her down. That was cruel. And he didn't even know it. So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. She remained desolate. She couldn't work it through. She couldn't process it in a healthy way, and neither did Absalom. She didn't speak up because he shut her down. He didn't speak up because he had revenge in mind. David, on the other hand, was another story. He was a very expressive person, right? Verse 21. Now when King David heard all these matters, he was very angry. That was the right response. Be angry, though, but do not sin. We don't know exactly what David did with his anger. In fact, he didn't do enough at all. But at least he didn't stuff it. If he had stuffed it, the court recorder wouldn't have made the note of the fact that he was very angry, as he does here. Verse 22, and get this. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad. Isn't that interesting? He gave him the silent treatment. Absalom did not speak to Amnon either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Oh, look out. What is he burying? And is he burying it alive or dead? He became a brother offended, a strong city, seething silently behind his fortress walls. And anything can happen under such circumstances. A whole lot of things can grow in that kind of darkness. So many serial killers are the silent types, right? The loners who end up surprising everyone. And how long did he refrain from speaking to his half-brother? Verse 23, now it came about after what? 2 full years. The Hebrew emphasizes this length of time. For 2 full years it festered in a dark hole. And what monster ascended from that abyss? What devilish creation, what opportunity did he give the devil? Fratricide. He killed his brother. This is an extreme example, but the righteous learn for themselves by watching ruin overtake the wicked. And I'm not going an inch in that direction. There's no telling what will happen behind fortress walls when you give the devil an opportunity. You can become so paranoid, obsessive, maybe vitriolic, unforgiving. Things can become so twisted, if you're anything like me, in the darkness of your mind. We almost don't need to tell the rest of the story. Again, verse 22, now it came about after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Belhazor, which was near Ephraim, and he invited all the king's son, and you know what they did. Where did it all begin? Well, David never punished his son Absalom. He did get angry, and at least he expressed it, but he didn't do the right thing with it. By law, he should have been stoned. In part, at least, I would submit to you, though, that it all began for Absalom anyway, when he chose not to speak to Amnon, either good or bad, and we can all do that. And hated him in his heart. And if that's not a lesson for us all, I don't know what is. He who separates himself seeks his own desire, and believe me, we quarrel against all sound wisdom in so many different ways. You know, I wonder if that's not what Solomon had in mind when he penned these words back in Proverbs 18:1, looking back over his family history. And if you're angry, like Absalom was, he's thinking, by speaking neither good nor bad, just don't do it. So we have a silent treatment that can so easily become like this silent torment that hurts us as much as them, that can become a sorry tragedy. Maybe not killing someone, but a broken relationship, divorce, never coming to church again, whatever. It can become a sorry tragedy. It could easily have happened to me. When I finished high school, I plunged into a deep and very dark depression. I never knew that I was depressed all the way through my upbringing when my first father died. But then I gave myself to my friends, and I was in Singapore, and they left to all corners of the world, and I was all alone. I had nothing, no one that I had given my life to, and I was in a very dark depression. And I had become a very quiet person, quiet especially towards my mother. I didn't realize it, but I was very angry at her because it was my mother and sister, and then me, just this boy who didn't have anyone to relate to, and they got along. And so I was separating myself from them, and I was very angry at them, and I got angry at my mother, and I never even knew I was until I finished high school. And let me just close with this. I went to work on an offshore oil rig in the South China Sea, and I worked on there 2 weeks. It would have killed me. They had to take all the fire axes out because they'd fight with them, and I was this young little boy virtually, and they did things to young little boys. But after 2 weeks, they sent a union man down from the Yokohama Union Hall to Brunei to take my place because I wasn't in the union, and I got bumped off that ship. And they flew me back to Singapore. My mom was really concerned about me. So she sat me down because my dad told her to do this. And in my bedroom, and she said, "Brian, we've just got to talk. And we need to do this each day. And maybe just 5 minutes, but we're going to do it." And being a more compliant type, I sat there for the first 5 minutes. I didn't say a thing. Then it stretched into 10, 15 minutes. The next meeting and the next. I didn't say anything. I was hurting her. I wouldn't talk to her. But we stuck it out. My dad was praying. And after about a week of this, I started to open up and started to express myself to my mother and tell her how I felt hurt. And I saw how stupid it was. And I asked her forgiveness. And it all came out of just choosing to open my mouth and talk. And that became a lesson I will never forget, that has stood me in good stead, all the way from being a pastor who gets hurt to being a husband who doesn't withdraw like I used to. And I would leave you with that. And I know many of you have learned this lesson too. Just talk. Don't let it build up. The second part of the answer is the reason why I talked. And it wasn't me. It was that my mother and my father and 1,500 people on their mailing list were praying for me. They asked my permission. Do you mind if we ask people to pray for you? And for some reason, I didn't know God existed or anything. I said yes. And it's because of that I talked, and much else.